In a war defined by the M16, the Claymore mine, and the Phantom jet, the most courageous man in the valley carried none of them. He carried a canvas bag heavy with gauze, morphine, and a burden that others refused to bear. He was unarmed, by choice. This was 1968, the Central Highlands of Vietnam, a place where the air itself seemed to vibrate with malice. The heat was a physical weight, the monsoon rains were a cold baptism, and the silence was often more terrifying than the roar of the guns. He was a combat medic, but he was also a conscientious objector. He had come to the war without a weapon, an act of faith that looked to the men around him like an act of madness. While others sought cover from the incoming tracers, he ran toward the sound of the screaming. He believed his purpose was not to take a life, but to save one. This is the story of a man who faced the very worst of humanity, armed only with that conviction. It is the story of how he did not change the war, but how he changed the men who fought it, proving that the deepest courage is not the power to kill, but the will to heal. His name was David, but the men in his platoon at first called him anything but. They called him preacher, or coward, or simply the objector. He arrived at the firebase near Pleiku with a quiet demeanor that was profoundly out of place. He looked soft, his eyes not yet hollowed by the things they were about to see. To the battle-hardened infantrymen of Alpha Company, men who slept with their rifles and counted their survival in inches, he was a liability, a ghost. He was the man who would not, could not, return fire. He was the man who would not pull security on the perimeter. In their eyes, he was a mouth to feed who would not protect the man next to him. War has a simple, brutal arithmetic, and in their calculation, David did not add up. His lieutenant, a man already aged by the weight of command, had pulled him aside on that first day. The air smelled of diesel fuel, red dust, and human waste. "I don't know what your God told you, son," the lieutenant had said, his voice flat. "But out here, God stays quiet. You don't carry a rifle. You're a danger to my men. You stay out of the way. You don't get anyone killed. Am I clear?" David had simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here to save them, sir," he replied. The lieutenant just shook his head and walked away. The first patrol was a test, not of the enemy, but of the soul. The jungle was not a place. It was an organism. It lived, and it wanted them dead. The heat was suffocating, a wet blanket that wrapped around the lungs. Every man carried 80 pounds of gear, but David carried his 80 pounds plus the agonizing weight of the aid bag, and the heavier burden of his platoon's scorn. He felt their eyes on his back. Every time he stumbled over a root, he heard the muffled curse. Every time he snagged on a "wait a minute" vine, he felt their impatience. This was the sensory reality of Vietnam. It was not the firefights you saw in the newsreels. It was the leeches that crawled into your boots. It was the fire ants that swarmed your skin. It was the maddening buzz of insects that seemed to penetrate the skull. And it was the silence, the terrible, knowing silence of the jungle, where a snapped twig meant the end of the world. David's mind was a storm of fear. He was not afraid of the enemy he could see. He was afraid of the one he couldn't. He was afraid of the booby traps, the tripwires, the pressure plates. And deep down, in a place he dared not touch, he was afraid of failing. What if his hands shook? What if he froze? What if his belief was just a form of pride? And when the moment came, he would be exposed as the coward they all thought he was. Then the world exploded. It was not a grand battle. It was a single, devastating thump. A pressure-detonated mine. The man on point, a young soldier from Ohio they called Cherry, was thrown backward in a pink mist. The patrol dove for cover, rifles snapping up, firing into the green wall of the jungle, firing at ghosts. The air split open with the high-velocity crack of M16s and the deeper, slower thud-thud-thud of the M60 machine gun. Men were screaming, not in pain, but in rage and terror. "Contact front! Get down! Medic! Medic! The word cut through the chaos, and it was aimed at him. David's world shrunk to a single point. His training took over, a series of automated responses that bypassed his fear. He was moving before he even registered the decision. He low-crawled, then sprinted the last 10 yards to where the point man lay. The man was catastrophically wounded. David saw it immediately. Both legs were gone below the knee. The jungle floor was turning dark and crimson. The lieutenant was screaming at him. "Get your head down, you fool! Get down!" But David was deaf to it. He was in the zone, the sacred, terrifying space of the medic. His hands, which had been trembling moments before, were now steady. He ripped open his bag. Gauze, battle dressings, tourniquets. He worked with a desperate, focused energy. He applied 2 tourniquets, high on the thighs, twisting the windlasses until his knuckles were white, cutting off the arterial spray. The soldier was conscious, his eyes wide with a horrifying, silent understanding. He was dying. He knew it. David leaned in close, his helmet touching the man's. He ignored the bullets snapping over his head, the green tracers that looked like angry fireflies. He held the man's face. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. "You are not dying today. I have you. You are going home." He administered a syringe of morphine, plunging it into the man's thigh. He talked to him, not as a medic, but as a brother. He told him about fishing back home, about cold beer, about the world that was waiting for him. He kept the man anchored to life, pulling him back from the gray edge with the sheer force of his will. He did this for 10 minutes, a lifetime, shielding the man with his own body until the firefight subsided and the others could move up to help. They stabilized him. They popped smoke. They called the dust off. As the Huey descended, its rotors beating the air into submission, the men watched David. He was covered in blood, his hands shaking now that the work was done. He had not fired a shot. He had not looked for the enemy. He had looked for his brother, and he had found him. The point man would live. The platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran, walked over and clamped a heavy hand on David's shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. It was more than enough. The men saw. They understood. This was not cowardice. This was a different kind of war. If you were there, you'd never forget that sound. The sudden, sharp gasp of air from lungs that were ready to quit. The first sound of a life reclaimed. It was the sound of a medic's victory. The months that followed bled into a nightmarish rhythm of search and destroy, of long, agonizing periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer primal terror. David became Doc. The name was no longer a title. It was a term of reverence. He had proven himself a dozen times over. In a firefight in a rice paddy, he had crawled on his belly through mud and water, under a withering crossfire, to reach a machine gunner who had taken a round to the chest. He arrived to find the man choking on his own blood. Doc, with no cover, inserted a chest tube, a desperate improvised measure, allowing the man to breathe. He dragged him 50 meters back to the tree line. The men of Alpha Company learned to trust him with their lives, and in return, they became his protectors. A strange, symbiotic relationship formed. When a firefight broke out, the platoon's first instinct was no longer just to find the enemy. It was to find Doc. "Where's Doc? Get Doc covered!" They would form a perimeter of fire around him, a wall of lead and steel, so that he could do his work. He was the only unarmed man in the company, and he was the most heavily guarded. He was the heart of the unit, and they were his armor. His conviction was tested, not just by the enemy, but by his own side. He saw the brutality of war, the way it hollowed out good men. He patched up soldiers, and he patched up Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire. He treated a young girl who had stepped on a forgotten French mine. He held an old man as he died, a man who looked at him with confusion, not hatred. This was the psychological dive, the journey into the moral ambiguity of the conflict. The war was not black and white. It was 1,000 shades of jungle green and blood red. Doc existed in the gray. He was not fighting for a political objective or for territory. He was fighting against the inevitable, fighting against the reaping. He was a shepherd in a valley of wolves. His psychological burden was immense. He saved so many, but he lost men too. He held their hands as the light left their eyes. He wrote letters home to their mothers, trying to find words that could explain the unexplainable. He carried the ghosts of the men he couldn't save. They were heavier than his pack. They were the true cost of his oath. Then came the battle for Hill 875. It was part of the larger, brutal conflict at Dak To. The NVA were dug in, fortified in bunkers, waiting. Alpha Company was sent up the hill, and they walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. The jungle erupted. It was not a firefight. It was a massacre. Mortars rained down, machine guns opened up from 3 sides. The company was shattered. Men were cut down in seconds. The air was thick with smoke, cordite, and the metallic smell of blood. The company commander was killed in the first volley. The radio operator was hit. The platoon was leaderless, pinned down, and being systematically destroyed. The call medic was not a call. It was a scream. It was a dozen screams at once. Doc began to move. He was no longer a man. He was an instrument. He ran from one wounded man to the next. He applied tourniquets, plugged sucking chest wounds with plastic wrappers from his rations, used his own shirt to pack a wound. He was a dervish of healing, a blur of motion in the middle of hell. A mortar round landed close, the concussion throwing him against a tree. His ears rang, his vision swam. He felt a sharp, hot pain in his shoulder. He'd been hit by shrapnel. He ignored it. He got up. He kept working. He saw his lieutenant, the same man who had doubted him, pinned down behind a blasted tree stump, a machine gun rattling the wood, chewing it to splinters. The lieutenant was hit badly in the leg, an arterial bleed. He was trying to crawl, but he was fading. The NVA gunner was focused on him, waiting for a clear shot. This was the moment, the turning point. Doc saw the lieutenant's dropped M16 lying just feet away. He could pick it up. He could lay down, suppressing fire. He could kill the man who was trying to kill his lieutenant. It was the logical choice. It was the only choice. He looked at the rifle. He looked at his bag. And he made his choice. He left the rifle in the mud. He grabbed his bag and he ran. He ran directly at the lieutenant, directly into the line of fire. The men of Alpha Company, who were still alive, watched in stunned disbelief. They thought he was committing suicide. Tracers zipped past his head, so close he could feel the heat. He didn't slow. He didn't even flinch. He dove, sliding the last few feet, landing on top of the wounded officer, shielding him with his own body. The machine gun hammered at them. Bullets tore through the thin fabric of Doc's pack, ripping through bandages and saline bags. But they did not touch him. He calmly, with the entire world trying to kill him, applied a tourniquet to the lieutenant's leg. He saved his life. The sheer audacity of the act, the blinding courage of the unarmed man, seemed to stun the enemy gunner for just a second. It was long enough. The platoon's M60 gunner found his target and silenced the NVA position. The spell was broken. The remaining men of Alpha, inspired by Doc's impossible bravery, rallied. They laid down a furious base of fire. They called in air support. The sky broke open with napalm and bombs. The battle for Hill 875 would rage for days, but Doc's war was won in that single instant. He became the living, breathing soul of the platoon. He was their faith. He was the proof that something good could exist even here. Comment, "I remember the Huey," if that sound still lives in you as the sound of impossible rescue, the sound of a medic who refused to let you go. Doc would be wounded 2 more times before his tour ended. The shrapnel in his shoulder was the first. The second was a bullet that grazed his temple, knocking him unconscious as he was dragging a man to a medevac helicopter. He refused the Purple Heart twice, saying he hadn't done anything the other men weren't doing. But they knew the truth. He was doing something far harder. He was facing the same enemy with none of the weapons. He was fighting a war against death itself. And he was winning. When his tour was over, the men he had served with, the men who had once called him a coward, lined up to see him off. They didn't shake his hand. One by one, the hardened, hollow-eyed survivors of Alpha Company embraced him. They wept. They were not losing a medic. They were losing their guardian angel. The lieutenant, his leg saved, was the last. He stood on crutches. He looked at Doc, his eyes filled with a respect that went beyond words. "You," the lieutenant said, his voice thick, "are the bravest man I have ever known." When David Cole came home, he carried no medals for valor that the world could see. His honors were invisible. They were the lives of the men who came home because of him. They were the children who would be born because he was there. They were the futures he had pulled from the mud and the blood. He did not save more lives than any soldier in the literal sense of a body count. He saved them in a way that was deeper. He saved the idea of humanity in a place that was designed to extinguish it. He proved that conviction is a force stronger than steel. He demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He showed that true strength is not the power to destroy, but the unyielding will to preserve. The others fought the enemy. He fought the war. He fought the chaos, the despair, and the grave. His weapon was his oath. His battlefield was the human heart. And his victory was every sunrise those men got to see, every breath they took, every time they held their families again. He refused to carry a gun, but he carried them all. His war was not against a flag. It was against the end. If this story moved you, write below. We never forget.